Hey there, welcome back to the show. This is the Holy Post Podcast. I'm Phil Vischer. I am here with Sky Jitani.
Hi, Phil.
Hi, Sky. How are you?
I'm all right.
All right. We do not have Christian this week. We used to do it where we rotated, and some weeks Christian would be there. Some weeks it would just be Sky and I. Some weeks we would have Drew Dick or Caitlin Beatty or someone else sitting on in the third chair. And then it was just Sky and I for quite a while Christian went off to make a movie. And then she came back from the movie and was around all the time. So then she started showing up all the time. And since she's now available just about every week, we're now moving back. Well, let's still rotate it a little bit. So sometimes it's just Sky and I, and then sometimes someone else might show up in that third seat. So
and this whole pandemic thing has lasted a little longer than we may have anticipated at the beginning, right?
The pandemic. So none of us are traveling. We're all readily available. So we're just mixing it up a bit more. Christian is not in the hospital or away. We're just doing a Sky Phil solo, and we have some really good, meaty, long interviews. So we wanted to keep the front ends a little shorter to get to the good, meaty, long, juicy interviews. And with that, here's the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Christian. Sky, do you like a good, meaty, juicy interview?
Oh, you know,
as much
at least
as the
once
next
a week.
Guy? As much as the next guy. We're recording this on Labor Day. Happy Labor Day, Sky.
Is that something people say?
I don't know. Now, Memorial Day, you don't say Happy Memorial Day because you're memorializing people who have died.
Right.
Labor Day, what are you doing? What are we doing at memorializing labor?
Yeah, you're not laboring. The point of Labor Day is to not labor.
No, that's the Sabbath.
But that's same diff.
So this is a secular Sabbath?
Kind of. But it's for the affirmation of labor by not laboring.
I'm not convinced that you know what you're talking about.
I'm pretty sure I don't.
Okay. I've got some stories. It's been a while, Sky, because we've been talking about serious things. It's a serious time, and there's lots of serious things to talk about. And it's been a while since, you just cut loose and say, what's going on in the butt world? Do you ever just cut loose and say that, Sky?
I don't. Usually when I cut loose and it involves a butt, it's not a good thing.
Oh, boy, it's time for News of the Butt.
And now it's time for News of the Butt.
So if you're new to the podcast, and if quite a few people are new to the podcast, you may be wondering, why the heck is there a segment called the News of the Butt? So we have to go back. I did a segment years ago now that was something bottom related that struck me as being very amusing. And just on a whim, I introduced it as, and now it's time for News of the Butt. And somehow that caught on as kind of a running gag. And so now listeners frequently send me news stories that they find from around the world involving the posterior of various creatures.
Okay, but to be fair, Phil, it wasn't.
Yes?
It wasn't just that the listeners latched onto this.
They demanded it.
Well,
they demanded
I think when you
Sky.
created a theme song for the segment, it was sort of inviting it.
No. That was after. First they demanded it, then I made a theme song.
Okay,
Demand breeds theme song, not the other way around. Okay, it's from the animal kingdom. My favorite ones, like the elephant dung gin. My favorite ones are usually from the animal kingdom. Frog eats beetle. Beetle escapes alive through frog's butt. And now, here's the amazing thing about this story. This is not just like one-time thing that happened where a beetle made it all the way through a frog without being digested. This is actually a particular kind of beetle that can do it every time.
So it is a frog digestive tract escape artist.
Yes.
It's like Chicken Run for beetles.
I think it's more like colon run, but that's okay. It is a Regimbartia attenuata beetle.
Does it have a vernacular name?
The aquatic beetle.
Oh.
It's the beetles that can kind of swim by forming air bubbles under their legs.
Well, that might explain something.
Exactly. So here's the deal. In a new study published Monday in the journal Current Biology, you know how many journals there are? I think it's infinite. We learned more about the evolution of escape behavior in prey animals, most notably the aquatic beetle. When this particular frog gulps this particular beetle, the beetle can survive by swimming through the frog's digestive tract to later be pooped out intact and alive. Then it just goes on its merry way. In one study, 93% of the beetles fed to a frog during this study period escaped the frog within 4 hours.
I bet in the beetle community, this is like a rite of passage.
I bet it is. Your turn. Your turn.
You got to go through the frog and come out the other side.
Go through we will see if you are a man, son. Enter the frog. It's like going on walkabout in the outback. And go to the frogabout. The quickest beetle escaped in 6 minutes.
Wow, he was like a laxative.
In the frog, out of the frog, 6 minutes, just wiped his hands off, went back to work.
That's like White Castle speed.
Isn't that amazing? The only thing they still need to research to figure out is they think there's some way that the beetles are actually getting the frogs to poop faster. Like they are a laxative.
Yeah, right. That's right. This is a kind of they speed up the process. They lubricate that toad. Yeah,
like they tickle them with their little swimmy toes, and then the frog says, "Excuse me, I'll be right back."
I've had a bad beetle.
I'm feeling a movement coming on. So that is the story of the aquatic beetle Regimbartia attenuata, who can be eaten and live to tell the tale.
Well, I do have a question.
What? I just wrapped it up so nicely, and
I know, but I'm curious now. Is this a quality that only applies to frogs? Like, if the beetle is eaten by anything else, can it escape? Can it make it through any other amphibious or fish digestive tract, or what else would eat a bird?
I don't have that information, Sky.
This is what I need to know. And could you take a bunch of these beetles and actually, were they used by like early human civilizations or tribes as a form of laxative?
I don't know that they really are a form of laxative. I just think they're good at tickling a frog's inside butt and escaping. What if they created flatulence and they actually were propelled 3 or 4 feet, like Jonah and the whale? Maybe that's how that happened. This is going
to come to Jonah at some point.
Maybe that's how that happened. It says the whale spit up Jonah. Was that just for, to not be insensitive to people's tender palates?
I don't know. There's a lot of euphemisms in Hebrew, so I'd have to look that one up. And maybe spitting up is a euphemism for explosive whale diarrhea.
Yeah. Is that your next book? The euphemisms of the Hebrews?
There's a lot of them.
That would be a good one.
Like when you hear about the seraphim flying with 6 wings and with 2 they covered their feet, that's not feet they were covering.
Why does it say feet?
It's a euphemism.
What does feet mean? Butt?
It means they're nether regions.
Why do we call them feet?
Because it's the more polite thing to say.
Okay. I didn't know that, but thank you. Mm-hmm. You should do a daily devotional that's a Hebrew euphemism of the day.
All the dirty bits of the Bible you didn't realize were there.
Sort of like a Far Side calendar where you just rip off one every day, which the frog is also doing with a beetle. But that's beside the point. Okay, this has been News of the Butt.
This has been the News of the Butt.
So again, if you're people who are new to the podcast, we're also asking on the website, holypost.com, can you explain the bell again? We're listening to back episodes, and there's this bell constantly going on. You haven't been doing him.
I've not been using him.
Yeah,
I'm going to pull him up right now. So Taco the Bell is a little app I have on my phone, and the bell, the ding sound, is what we had been using it was our product placement bell. So when a brand name or a product is mentioned that is sort of free advertising, we would ring the bell as our way of acknowledging that some product placement has occurred and somebody is benefiting, probably not us.
Oh, definitely not us. No.
And
Have
we
we
named-
ever actually used it in a situation where we're getting paid?
I don't know if we have.
I don't think we have.
No. But because of his commercial purposes, we named the bell Taco the Bell.
Yeah.
Which in itself is a brand placement
Ding.
moment.
Oh, that's quiet.
It's kind of weak. Hold on, let me
on,
crank it
Taco.
up.
Come on. Oh,
There we go.
yeah, that's nice. That was beautiful. The dulcet tones of Taco the Bell. So now you know why we do news of the butt, even though it seems, on the surface, kind of repulsive, and why we have a bell dinging whenever we mention a brand. For those of you that are new. Okay, next story.
Welcome to the club.
Yes, now now you have hidden knowledge. Now you have Gnostic wisdom that you can withhold or share as you see fit to try
We're
to.
like a rival to QAnon.
Ooh. Should we do our own QAnon, like make up our own thing? But we can't tell anybody about it. So this is probably bad to discuss it on the podcast because it would have to be anon.
What would you want to call it?
Emanon. Eminem.
Emanon?
M, like it, James Bond.
Oh.
Emanon.
Oh, because Q is the quartermaster and M. You know what those stand for, don't you? In James Bond.
No.
Q is quartermaster and M is minister.
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 Okay.
Minister.
Oh, I didn't know
Yeah.
that.
That's what they stand for.
You know so many things
I do about James Bond. I do.
about James Bond and Star Wars.
Mm-hmm.
You know a lot of things about Star Wars. Sky people are losing it, and I'm a little concerned. The last 6 months, I'd say overall, have been pretty good. Wouldn't you say overall pretty good?
180,000 people probably would disagree with you.
Okay. I was kidding. You didn't have to put it on that footing.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. Now, I look like the idiot. Thank you. But people are starting to lose it. And I want to give you two exhibits, Exhibit A and Exhibit B. Exhibit A, people are starting to lose it. Jim Gaffigan.
Yes.
Jim Gaffigan lost it. Yeah, if you don't know, he went on like 2 weeks ago. He went on while watching the Republican National Convention, did something very uncharacteristic for him with his reputation as a clean and non-political kind of family-friendly comedian. Went on a tirade on Twitter that could best be called profanity-laced about Trump supporters.
There were quite a few F-bombs.
Yeah, it just went off as if he never wants a conservative Trump supporter to buy a ticket to one of his concerts ever again. And he just
hasn't he been making more moves into dramatic filmmaking?
A little bit, but that's not where his money comes from.
No, probably not.
He has 2 new specials up on Netflix or
Amazon Prime.
Yeah, I think Amazon Prime right now. So he may just be at the point where he realizes he's going to be fine. Maybe he won't keep growing in income, but he's fine. So, and there's probably part of you, if you're trying to be so safe all the time, that then watches a David Chappelle special, says, man, I wish I could do that just a little bit. I wish I could just.
Is there any record of a comedian? There's certainly been comedians who've started like Gaffigan, who are clean or kind of family friendly, who have gone more adult.
Well,
are there any examples?
Bill Cosby started out family friendly and then he went to prison. Is that what you're talking about?
No, that's a whole different deal. Okay. I'm wondering, are there any comedians that started out more off color, crude,
and then
profane, cleaned it up and kind of moved toward the family friendly audience?
I don't know if that's even possible.
That's what I'm wondering. Like, could you imagine a Dave Chappelle going out there and say, hey, listen, going forward, no more swearing, no more derogatory language about anybody.
Right.
I'm keeping it clean.
Yeah, that's Snoop Doggy Dogg tried to kind of clean up his act. He felt he was being disrespectful too much, and he changed his name to Lion at one point, and then because he kind of had a spiritual awakening of some kind and felt he was degrading the African American experience, and so he changed his name and then tried to clean things up, and then kind of said never mind. And
That's
then
not what the market wants.
and then Prince stopped doing some of his old songs when he became a more committed Jehovah's Witness. He wouldn't play his more sexual songs, so that's a little bit of something.
Yeah.
I have a friend who's a clean comedian. There's a whole world of Christian comedians, that do church events and stuff. And he was actually, because Disney likes comedians for cruise ships, but you're going to do a kids show if you're on a Disney cruise ship, and you're a comedian. You're going to do a kids show, so you have to be clean.
Right.
So they like some of these guys, Christians that are used to performing clean. So he did 3 or 4 Disney cruises. He finally was told that he wouldn't be coming back. And it wasn't because of anything he did with his kids shows. It was because you also then do a later night grown-up show, and that's supposed to be less clean. And he wasn't able to do what they wanted him to do.
Wow.
So his clean persona was great and they loved it, but they assumed you can flip a switch and then have a little more racy body thing for the grown-ups.
That's kind of weird. I'm surprised they don't just bring on 2 different comedians.
Then you got to give up 2 rooms. Do you know what a room
Make
is
them stay
worth?
in the same room.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's.
I don't know. It just seems.
Can you imagine
how many
being
people
being on a cruise ship for a week and sharing a room with another comedian that you don't even know? What's that like?
But isn't that just ripe for material?
Probably. Okay, so
Jim's expecting a bit too much, I would think.
Jim Gaffigan, he apologized. No, he didn't really apologize. Actually, he said he wasn't apologizing.
Right.
And he said he would do it again. So he's doubling down because he's as mad as heck, and he's just not going to take it anymore.
When I read the Twitter tirade, sorry.
Was that a Hebrew euphemism?
Yeah. I'm tired. When I read what Gaffigan said, I didn't know how to react, because part of me appreciated the blunt honesty with which he spoke, but on the flip side, I felt bad for him.
Yeah.
And because obviously something has driven him to this point of feeling like he just has to blow his top publicly in social media in a way that's out of character. And it just made me think we are living at a moment that is just bringing out the worst in everybody.
You think?
Or I could say, put it more pointedly, I think we have a president who brings out the worst in everybody.
Okay, well, that's
on all sides.
That's kind
on
of
all
pointed.
Sides. So it is.
Can I bring us to Exhibit B?
Sure.
Eric Metaxas.
Yes.
Kind of lost it.
He hasn't said much about it, though. We should probably tell people who aren't familiar with what we're referencing.
Yeah, Eric Metaxas, kind of an acquaintance of mine, used to work at Big Idea at one point.
And I believe the very first guest we ever had on this show.
The very first guest we ever had on the show. Punched a protester. Kind of lost it. He was at the White House last speech of the Republican National Convention, where Trump used the White House as the backdrop and had, 1,700 people there, 1,200 people there or something, all dressed up and not social distancing. And Eric Metaxas was one of them. And then leaving the event, you may have seen in the news where Rand Paul and his wife were kind of accosted by aggressive protesters on the way out of the event. And Eric Metaxas and his wife were walking down a street away from the White House, and a protester rode by on a bicycle screaming F Trump, very loudly and aggressively. And Eric punched him and then ran away from him backwards.
Yeah. When I first saw the report and then watched the video, I don't know if it was the version of the video I saw or the platform I was watching it on, but I just couldn't really see clearly what happened.
Yeah.
And I thought, this is ambiguous. I don't know if Eric was reacting because the guy almost hit him or his wife or something else was going on here. It wasn't clear to me.
Yeah.
And so everyone was flipping out on social media going after Eric. And I thought, okay, Eric has certainly said some inflammatory things in the past, but let's give him the benefit of the doubt here. Later, I went back and I found a much clearer version of the video, and there's really nothing ambiguous about it.
Really?
Like he really decked this guy and he hit him from behind. So it was just very, very
Sucker
ugly.
punched a protester.
Yeah.
But then it gets better. Eric was in the frame of losing it in the current state of events. He was on Tucker Carlson on September 2nd, and the topic came up. He's been on Tucker Carlson like a few times lately, that a Catholic priest in a Catholic mass, I forget where, New York City, asked the congregants to let go of their white privilege. Okay. So Tucker Carlson asked Eric Metaxas what he thought of that. And Eric said, to be honest with you, it's as if they had a swastika on the altar. It would be no different.
Did he elaborate more than that?
Yes, he said, churches have always been at the forefront of fighting racism and slavery. Always, Sky. Churches have always.
Yeah, he's right. But he's only telling not even half the story. Right? There have always been Christians fighting for those good and just things, but there have been a whole heck of a lot of churches trying to maintain them.
Yeah. What we are seeing here is something else entirely. The people who are using these new terms, systemic racism, that new term that was just invented last Tuesday, or white privilege, these are Marxists. They not only don't believe in God, they hate God. And on the website, the BLM website, they reject just about everything a Christian would say. So that's what they're doing now. It's a power play. They want to hollow out the church from the inside because the real church is their enemy. So hence, mentioning white privilege from the pulpit is akin to putting a swastika on the pulpit. That's
and the
aggressive.
irony is the Nazis were the white supremacist racists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that just shows you how weird the world is today.
But the people who are calling out white supremacy are now the Nazis.
Racism are the Nazis in our world today. And I think it's probably because of the media or George Soros, but I'm not sure. I'll have to get back to you on that.
I mean, have we really reached the point where words genuinely mean nothing? That we can just make them and make history whatever we want it to be?
In some circles, I think so. I'm hoping not broadly. Okay, so this brings me to a piece written by Cap Stewart. I don't know him. He's writing for the Gospel Coalition, published on the Gospel Coalition, and I think this is worth visiting. The headline is, "If you're fighting the culture war, you're losing." And then he starts out by mentioning a new Christian consortium dedicated to preserving religious liberty is promoting its mission with militaristic imagery and language. The group's website uses terms like battle, fighters, and war. It's clear the founders of this organization see themselves as being on the front lines of the conflict for the soul of our nation. They are proud participants in the ongoing culture war. Then he says, the question we must ask is this: is a warlike posture the proper response to an increasingly anti-Christian society? Does such an approach represent the wisdom that comes down from above, or the wisdom that is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic? Quoting James 3:13 through 18. So, and then he tries to unpack what is wrong with fighting a culture war. What is wrong with being a combatant in a war with your culture or for your culture? He says, by embracing the culture war paradigm, many Christians adopt an all's fair in love and war perspective. And so we employ battle tactics we normally would not find defensible. We express outrage over every new infraction we see in the news or on social media, forgetting that we're neither to give in so easily to anger nor to imitate the evils of outrage culture and cancel culture. We fight and quarrel with our opponents, forgetting that such skirmishes stem from selfish motivations and that the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome but kind to everyone. 2 Timothy 2:24. We mock those in opposition to us, using the popular rhetoric of sarcastic memes, name-calling, and condescending language, forgetting that we're to communicate with gentleness and respect and to walk in wisdom toward outsiders by letting our speech always be gracious. Again, giving lots of scriptural references for all of these. Or as Jesus himself put it, if my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, but my kingdom is not from this world.
So taking Jesus words there. Can we say that Christians who are bent on fighting a culture war are revealing the fact that they don't belong to him?
Yeah, that's a valid question to raise. Who would you like to get on the phone and ask if this applies to them? Any prominent Christian leaders?
I think what I would boil it down to is any Christian, it doesn't have to just be the culture warriors, but any Christian whose primary posture toward the world is one of fear is not being led by the Spirit of Christ.
Yeah.
And a leader who claims to be a Christian and is using fear to generate more anger and activism is not leading you by the Spirit of Christ, but by the spirit of Antichrist.
Yeah, he has a quote from Jonathan Edwards that I'd never heard before. He says, in the words of Jonathan Edwards, sorry, do we engage one who opposes us without angry reflections or contemptuous language, and as seeking his good rather than his hurt, and more to deliver him from the calamity into which he has fallen, than to be even with him for the injury he has brought? And then summarizes that by saying, as these words suggest, we are not at war with our ideological opponents. We are at war for them. To engage with our culture in a militant and hostile manner is to forsake our role as ambassadors. It's trading our diplomatic visas for military dog tags.
What he describes there is exactly what is so compelling about Martin Luther King Jr.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote and preached and spoke frequently about not just wanting to free Black Americans from the indignity of segregation, but to free whites from the deforming evil of segregation on them.
Right.
So it wasn't us against them. It's we're trying to free everybody. And it was framed by the gospel. It was framed by the teachings of the kingdom of God.
That was in clear contrast to, some other civil rights leaders like Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael was another one, who were much more antagonistic, or militant, and say, no, if white people have had the right to oppress and fight and bear arms, well, we should do the same thing. So he really was taking a profoundly Christian view of how we fight for justice. And then in the next week or two, we'll be airing an interview with Jamar Tisby, who wrote the book, The Color of Compromise, of the church's complicity with racism in America, which, by the way, Eric, if you're listening, read it, because the church was not always on the right side of history in terms of race relations. And Jamar goes through that very, very well. And why did I bring that up?
I don't know. But you're right. I mean, going back to King and his advocacy to free white people from their enslavement to white supremacy and segregation and all those evils of racism. When you look at what's going on in the culture wars today, you don't hear that rhetoric from
anybody.
Either side.
No.
It's we need to win, we need to defeat them in order to have power and control. And pick your side. They're both, the rhetoric's the same on both sides. It's not we need to advocate for justice in order not just to protect us and our tribe, but we want to do what's best and loving for the people who have aligned themselves as our opponents.
Yep.
That rhetoric is missing even from the Christians, where it should be at home.
Right. Cap Stewart closes this essay by saying, by divine decree, everyone is our neighbor, no exceptions. And we win our neighbors through the same love that won us. So how do we, there's a question for you, Sky. How do you defend what is good if what is good is at risk? If you see your culture, your society turning on vulnerable people, for example, whether it's the unborn or immigrants or refugees or, whatever it is, how do you oppose injustice without becoming this?
Well, I think you've already answered it. I mean, it's easier to say, how should you not oppose injustice? But if you become the thing you are opposing, you've already lost.
Okay.
Which is exactly what the cross is all about, right? Yeah. Jesus didn't succumb to the ways of Rome or power or empire. Instead, he surrendered to them and thereby defeated them. He disarmed the powers and authorities, as Paul talks about. So we believe in a kingdom in which you do not fight fire with fire. You fight fire with water. And if you find yourself having to use the same tactics, the evil tactics of your enemy, and justify it because your ends are noble or holy, you've already lost.
Yeah.
And it's better for the people of God to go to martyrdom, holding to the way of the kingdom, than it is to win a victory, supposedly in the name of God, but do so in a way which is inconsistent with his character and kingdom. Death is always better than doing things the way of the world. That's what Revelation is all about. We've had Juan Hernandez on numerous times, and he's talked about Revelation. That's really the essence of it. Be willing to go to your death standing by the values of the kingdom of God rather than succumbing to the values of the world.
But I don't want to.
Well, then you're not fit for the kingdom.
It doesn't sound fun, Sky. I like war movies. I want to go in. I play, shoot 'em up games. I want to go in with all barrels blazing.
Well, that speaks to an interview that I did recently, which will be airing here soon. I don't know when, with David French. Follow up about guns and things. And what's the Christian supposed to do with the society with 400 million guns now? It's a complicated mess.
At the very least, if I engage the culture, can I use the weapon of a frog that shoots beetles out of its backside?
I would love to see that, because I imagine just watching that would disarm people, and we would all come together.
It's so charming. It's so charming. Yeah. Little poop-laden beetles flying at my enemies. Okay, we have a guest, right?
We do.
We have an abundance of guests.
We have a lot of good stuff coming up.
Great interviews in the can. The next few weeks are going to be fantastic. Okay, so thanks for stopping by. Now you know what the News of the Butt is about. Now you know what the Taco the Bell is about. And now you know that if you're a culture warrior, back up and be a culture lover. Is that right? Being going to be a culture lover? Can I? Not that you love the culture.
Didn't Michael Jackson say that to Paul McCartney? Paul McCartney.
Martin.
I told you I'm tired. I'm a lover, not a fighter. Wasn't that one of that duet they did?
Ebony and Ivory.
No.
Ebony and Ivory.
That was Joe Piscopo and Eddie Murphy.
Live together. Okay, we gotta go. We will see you next week. Here comes the interview.
In a very unscientific Twitter poll, I asked people about their church engagement amid the pandemic. About half said they are still watching their church's online streaming service, but 25% confessed that they've tuned out completely. This global health crisis is making a lot of people rethink their church involvement. It's causing us to ask questions like, can we be the church without a building? Why do we put so much emphasis on preaching? How do we fulfill the church's mission if we can't gather in large groups? And some people are even asking if the time's come for a new model, even when the pandemic is over. Because I've encountered so many friends asking these questions, I've decided to start a new series this fall in With God Daily about the church. We'll be looking at critical questions like, why is gathering important? What does it mean for the church to be God's family, not just an institution? Why do some churches focus on the table and others the pulpit? How has consumerism affected our view of the church? And what are pastors really for anyway? And that's just scratching the surface. You can join the series by signing up at withgoddaily.com. A donation of any amount will not only get you access to the daily email and audio devotional, but you can also download the mobile app for the full archives of With God Daily. There's never been a better or more critical time for us to think deeply and prayerfully about the church. So sign up today at withgoddaily.com. It's the daily devotional for people who hate daily devotionals.
You've probably noticed that our culture is becoming increasingly divided about seemingly everything. For that reason, I'm really grateful that my good friend J.R. Briggs is here today to talk about his new book, The Sacred Overlap, Learning to Live Faithfully in the Space Between. I realize that subtitle may not describe exactly what the book is about, but essentially what JR is talking about is the way that Jesus often avoided the controversies of his day, the divisions of his day, by seeking a different plane, a different way of viewing things, an overlap, a both and rather than an either or. This isn't about compromise or finding common ground. It's about learning to see things from the perspective of God's kingdom rather than just the kingdoms of the world. And this doesn't just apply to our politics or social controversies, but even to our understanding of the church, of our mission, of all aspects of the Christian life. I think JR just brings a lot of wisdom to this conversation, and this is the kind of book that we need in this cultural moment. So here's my conversation with JR Briggs, and for those of you who are Patreon subscribers, you're definitely going to want to stick around for the bonus segment, because he talks about the church he planted 12 years ago in Philadelphia and the model of church that he employed, which has actually been thriving during this pandemic. While a lot of churches are really struggling and collapsing because of COVID, JR and his community have a model that I think more and more people are intrigued by, and you're definitely going to want to hear about it. So thank you for our Patreon subscribers for supporting this podcast, and you can look forward to that bonus segment. And if you're not a Patreon subscriber, you know what to do. Go to holypost.com and click on support, and you'll begin to get access to this kind of great bonus content. Here's my conversation with JR Briggs.
JR, welcome back to the Holy Post. Grateful to have you back.
Thanks for having me back, Sky. It's always good to be with you.
Okay, so we've known each other for a long time, and even before we started recording this, we were already getting hot into church and the pandemic and models and all that. So I just want to tell everybody up front, we're going to record a bonus segment on Patreon for our subscribers where we're going to talk about that, because you planted a church, what was it, 12 years ago?
Yeah, 12 years ago. Yep.
With a model that required very little adaptation in this pandemic. And so we're going to talk about that and what you're learning as you coach other pastors. But we're primarily going to talk about your new book, The Sacred Overlap. And hold on, I keep forgetting the subtitle.
I thought we were going to talk about drinking South African gin. You know,
gosh, don't bring up the news of the butt stuff. That's Phil. That's all Phil. And thankfully, I don't even like gin, so I would never be tempted to try that. No, we're talking about your book, The Sacred Overlap, Learning to Live Faithfully in the Space Between. I love the cover and I like the title, but to be honest, it's not that obvious what you're talking about.
Yeah.
In the title. So what is the sacred overlap?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't think we have to convince anybody about how tribalistic and divisive everything has become. And so as we become more and more divisive, I just began to look around and say, wait a second. If we're more divisive than ever before, this run up to the election in the fall, with all of these divides that are happening, growing stronger, I just find myself saying, as a follower of Jesus, taking Jesus seriously, there's got to be a better way. How can this be? And so if there's a better way, it's got to be more winsome and more believable and more faith-filled than just kind of going to our own bunkers and living in this tribalistic spirit. And so what does it look like? What if we had a posture where we were able to be faithful in these alienating times that actually embraced some of that healthy tension? We sort of live in these either or worlds, but what does a both and kind of posture look like as a follower of Jesus? So that's kind of the nature of the book, of how do we be faithful followers of Jesus, but live in that, again, the sacred overlap, because Jesus actually lived quite a bit in that both and reality. We are in evangelicalism, we're sort of taught to think only either or, and he certainly does call us to either or. But once we follow him in the either or, it's a little bit uncomfortable for us when we realize how much he lived in the both and. So it's kind of exploring and trying to tease that out. Basically, it's a little bit, I know you had what Justin Giboney on earlier. What the AND campaign is doing for politics, this book is trying to extend to all areas of our lives. So that's the vision of the book.
Good way to put it. On the cover are these what appear to be 4 Venn diagrams.
Yeah.
The overlapping circle diagrams that a lot of people are familiar with from math class and other illustrations, which plays a pretty central role in your book, but it has a much larger history than just Venn diagrams. So talk about what that symbol actually is and where it comes from.
Yeah. And by the way, I think the Zondervan team did a great job with the cover. I actually think it looks like Eric Carle's The Very Hungry Caterpillar kind of feel to it.
Yes, it has that kind of watercolory look to it, which is
a little crepe
right.
paper kind of overlap. So
yeah.
But yeah, I love Venn diagrams. I'm obsessed by them, even enough to put a tattoo of a Venn diagram on my arm. I just have always felt this sort of tension as a follower of Jesus, of living in that is so important. And even John Venn, who's not the inventor of it, but he's the popularizer of the Venn diagram. He really articulated spiritually what is not a new concept. For hundreds of years, Christian artists have tried to articulate so much of the incarnation and who Jesus is in that overlap shape. And that overlapping shape, anytime you look at a Venn diagram, you see that football shape that actually has a word, a name, and it's called a mandorla, which is the Italian word for almond. And that football shape is where Jesus, throughout history, Christian artists have placed him in the middle of this football shape. And if you look at it, you can't unsee it now. I mean, look around at Christian art and stained glass windows and old icons, you'll find Jesus in that football shape all the time, because the fully God and fully man, full of grace and truth, right? And justice and mercy, there's all these overlapping spaces. And they really believe the best way to articulate that was to put Jesus in the middle of a mandorla. And so therefore, if we follow Jesus, we should be living in the middle of those mandorlas as well. So I'm a visual learner. So for me, that was a very important visual that ran throughout the book.
It's kind of interesting too, that when you take that mandorla, the football shaped, almond shaped overlaps thing, and you extend it a little bit, you get the Christian ichthus logo symbol.
Yeah.
Right?
Isn't that funny? I did some research on that. It's not intended to be that, but one day I was actually teaching on this. This was about 3 or 4 years ago. And I erased half of the Venn diagram and then turned around to make a point and turned back around, and it was a perfect ichthus. And that's where it first hit me. Oh my gosh, there are so many more layers to this if we're willing to go there. Even the Celtic triquetra, like so a 3-factored Venn diagram, is the same thing, right? We sort of see the leaf there. That's just the overlap. And what a beautiful thing of describing the Trinity, right? 3 and 1, 1 and 3, as sort of this Celtic triquetra of overlap of the 3. And you can just tease that out. I mean, you can go down a rabbit hole and get all nerded out on these Venn diagrams and how they tie in very well to theology. And as a visual learner, this really was singing with me during my research.
Well, it's one of the reasons I love your book so much, is because I am also a visual learner, which explains all my ridiculous doodles.
The doodles, yeah.
But before we get into sort of the practical application of this way of thinking in the contemporary issues, let's lay down the theological foundations. Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of people making the case for the need to be civil in our cultural engagement, to think beyond the either or, tribalism, as you talked about. The AND campaign is doing that in politics. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of great reasons to engage in that kind of cultural model that doesn't require a Christian theological foundation.
Yeah.
But what you bring in this book is a robust engagement with Scripture and theology. So let's talk about the origins of this in the core doctrines of our faith.
Yes, great. And I'm really glad you bring that up. And it's really, I believe that people will misunderstand me if they don't read the book or understand this fully, because what I'm not advocating for is some sort of culturally hip, spineless middle ground of compromise that sort of panders to both sides to make sure everyone is appeased in our culture. I actually think living in the overlap takes more courage and more faith and more hope than even before. And so, one thing that really set this off in my brain, I was in college, actually. My girlfriend, soon to be wife at the time, we went to a college retreat, and there was a guy named Dick Staub, and he had this quote that it gripped me and has stuck a hook in my heart and remained there ever since. He said, "When we're faithfully following Jesus, we will be too Christian for our pagan friends and too pagan for our Christian friends." And I think that really gets at the root of this idea that, again, we see in Scripture some very clear either-ors, right? I mean, life and death, choose this day whom you will serve, right? 1 John talks about light and darkness. But once we surrender our lives to Christ and his kingdom, that's where Jesus sort of invites us to a different way of seeing the world, into this sort of both and reality. And That's where we have to hold that intention, because it's not well, do whatever you want with Jesus and just kind of fit him in and do this theological gymnastics move. No, it's about Jesus and his kingdom. But even in that, to represent him faithfully, Jesus went to a lot of places that the more I read my Bible, the more uncomfortable I get. And the more I realize that sort of a traditional evangelical upbringing doesn't often recognize or give any validity towards. So, I mean, think about the examples of Jesus, right? Fully God and fully man, the incarnation, right? Full of justice and mercy. He interacts with the woman at the well, right? And the idea of worshiping in spirit and truth. The kingdom of God is here, but it's near. There's just so many. He honored the Jews, but then he would hang out with Samaritans and Roman centurions and women from Syrophoenicia, So there's just this, he just doesn't fit in a particular box. And so the more we read about him, the more uncomfortable we get. And I think the Pharisees, one of the reasons they were so angry with him is because of the fact that he didn't fit into an either or box. And that's what they were so upset about. Right? Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God. So do both. Anyway, I could keep going, but let me pause there because there are so many examples.
There are a lot of examples. I wonder how much of our difficulty with this is rooted in our Western modern Enlightenment cultural framing, right? Because when I talk to people from outside of that context, who are from the global South or from especially Eastern, more Asian cultural ways of thinking, they don't have as much of a problem with what appear to be paradoxical or contradictory things held in tension. But those of us with European Enlightenment kind of mindsets just can't handle that. Although that doesn't explain why the Pharisees couldn't handle it, because they were from the same cultural context as Jesus. So I don't want to overstate this. But how much of it is just that our Christianity has been shaped by modernity?
Yeah,
which makes everything either or, black and white, and we have to think more like ancients.
Yeah, it's a great question. And in the book, I talk a great deal about the Eastern Orthodox tradition and how those in the Eastern Orthodox faith can teach us a great deal if we're willing to learn from them. This idea of tension, paradox, mystery, we see that as a curse. They see that as a beautiful gift and a blessing that helps them worship God even more fully. So when we were in Istanbul, we were able to visit the world headquarters of the Eastern Orthodox church, and it was amazing. Their reverence for mystery and of paradox really opened something up in me that I hadn't been able to recognize before. But modernity has shaped it a great deal, which is why we have to make sure we don't read Scripture as American Christians, but as Christians who happen to live in America. And I think that's an important distinction of how we read the Scriptures. Because if we read the Scriptures inaccurately, we will then extrapolate that into the Christian life being very painful, dangerous, and even demonic if we're not careful.
Wow. One of the examples that comes to mind is the way a lot of European Protestant traditions have thought about communion, right? Where there were wars fought over this issue. Like, is this cup and bread just a symbol? Is it just wine, grape juice, or bread? Or is there something of the presence of Jesus in this? And the Protestant tradition, for the most part, depending on which one you look at, has said, no. It's symbolic alone. It's just a device to mentally recollect the presence of Jesus or his death on the cross, whatever it might be. Whereas there are other traditions, Eastern traditions, even the Roman Catholic tradition, which have held it in more mystery and tension to say it can be multiple things at once. It can be bread and wine, but it can also be in an inexplicable way the presence of God and his grace. So there's a willingness to hold those things in tension without having to explain it, whereas the Northern European tradition of Protestantism, no, you have to pick one. It's one or the other. You can't have it both ways. And that has tended to permeate then everything we think about. Like, you can't be, I don't want to pull one out of the air because I'll probably say something horrible that'll set off somebody on Twitter. But well, okay, let's get political for a second. I know people, including within my own church tradition, who would say you cannot be a Christian and a Democrat. Like they're mutually exclusive identities. And it's kind of ridiculous when there are thousands and millions of devoted followers of Christ who are Democrats. There's overlap there, but everyone wants to make it an either or kind of thing. Now you're seeing some on the other side saying you cannot be a Christian and vote Republican.
Right.
So we want this either or thing and refuse the overlap. Where do you see this? You coach a lot of pastors. How do you see pastors falling into this trap?
Yeah.
And what's the impact for them and their ministry?
It's a great question. They are oftentimes feeling they're at the mercy of those who are in a very modern either or mindset. And so again, trying to pander to both sides can be very difficult. We're sometimes so stuck in modernism that we think any opportunity for a both and is relative postmodern. And that's just not the case all the time. And so, I mean, in thinking about it, I mean, if you think about closing one eye, you can still see, but your depth perception and your peripheral vision is skewed significantly. I mean, I think of like an outfielder trying to catch a pop fly. Like you can maybe catch a pop fly with one eye, but it's nearly impossible unless you're a brilliant athlete. And if we are only keeping one eye shut, we're missing out on the depth perception and the peripheral vision that can come in our faith of still being deeply committed and faithful followers of Jesus. And so that idea of two eyes being open is so crucial. And I do think that our churches beat out of our theology oftentimes mystery and paradox. And so we have to be so careful about that because how do you explain the incarnation without mystery and paradox? What do you mean 100% man, 100% God? That's 200%. Like, how does that work? So we have to be willing to live in that. Even the idea of the Trinity, like 3 in 1, 1 in 3. Like, so the basic core tenets of our faith, you can't solve them with modern logic. So the invitation is to come into paradox and mystery, not as something to be solved, but as something to be beholden and to be wrapped up in, to cause us to worship Christ even more. And that's, again, back to the Eastern Orthodox. They do this so well, our brothers and sisters in that tradition, even their mosaics. I mean, we've seen Christ Pantocrator, like even the face of Jesus looks different. And that's very intentional, where it looks like, wait, is one eye, they're not symmetrical. Well, that's intentional. That's not bad artwork. That's good theology, that they're intentionally making Jesus and these Pantocrator, I'm not even saying that right, paintings are so beautiful. These mosaics that are even in Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, these very famous ones, they're intentionally asymmetrical to bring that idea of mystery, of this divine God who wrapped himself in human flesh. Every Christmas is a mystery. Every season of Advent is a mystery. Every Lent is a mystery. Will we embrace it, or will we still try to stick to our sort of modern either-or boxes?
But if we embrace mystery, JR, we won't be able to build walls and boundaries to keep out lies and heresy, right?
Imagine that.
Or just evil people. Yeah. So apart from the incarnation and the Trinity and some of the other theological examples that you listed, and apart from politics, where do you see this having application in our contemporary Christian lives?
Yeah, sure.
Take it out of the realm of theoretical theology and bring it into practical theology. What do we do with this in ordinary Christian life?
Yeah, great question. I think the idea of we've really bifurcated discipleship from evangelism. And we sort of, one of the questions I love to ask is, when did Peter become a Christian? Some would say right at the beginning on the shore when Jesus called him. Some would say not even until the book of Acts, maybe Acts 10 or 11, with his conversion with the sheet in the dream. So when did he become a Christian? Well, I think we have to be very careful. We don't bifurcate. Evangelism happens pre, discipleship happens post. I think, too, the discussions that are happening with social justice these days, we sort of think you either can't care about that, or if you care too much, you're a liberal and you can't follow Jesus in the midst of that. And I think there are all sorts of ways to do that. I actually think one of the people that does this well, though I don't agree with him on everything, I think Shane Claiborne lives the overlap very, very well. Because as soon as you have him pegged, then you go, whoa, wait a second. But it's all very Christocentric in how he's living. And I so appreciate that about the ways in which he does that, and in a very winsome way, that he's strong in his conviction, and yet he does it with such laughter and joy. And I think his Southern accent certainly helps with some of that winsomeness as well. So, but there's all sorts of, things that we could put in there. if we want to go there, I mean, Black Lives Matter. You know, a lot of people, obviously it's been very divisive on that. I have wondered this, and I may get myself in trouble here, but I have thought about this a great deal with all of these rallies, and my family and my youngest son is African-American. And so we've been to some Black Lives Matter rallies, and that's been important to us. But I've also thought about this. The majority of abortions in America happen to African-American babies. And I've just wondered, how would a protester be treated if they showed up to a BLM rally holding a sign that read "Unborn Black Lives Matter"? Now, I don't know. Yeah. But I think that those are the kind of risky spaces that people in the overlap do say, yeah, Black lives do matter here. When do they begin to matter? And so that's sort of that really courageous space that needs to be stepped into.
You're addressing some of the psychological realities of this overlap. And you mentioned earlier that some people might misinterpret this as you're being wishy-washy so that you can just conform to whatever you want. It feels like somebody could advocate for this both and approach for one of two reasons. Either, now I'm going either or, either because they want to be accepted by everyone. And not exclude anything or anyone and have it all. Yeah, everything's included. Or kind of the way it worked out for Jesus is he lived in the sacred overlap to the point where he was accepted by no one because he kind of pissed off everybody.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that I think is an interesting exercise in self-awareness. When I look out at the culture or what's going on around me or the different groups that I bump into, is my instinct to want to find acceptance by everyone and therefore smooth out the rough edges of my faith and some of the convictions of God's kingdom? Or am I pursuing that both and thing because I'm so committed to Christ and his kingdom that I'm going to live that way, and it may well alienate people from both sides in the process, which ultimately gets you on the cross?
I think you get shot at from both sides when you faithfully live this out. And something, I think it was Tim Keller that said, when you're wondering if you are close to the edge or you're over the edge as a follower of Jesus, he said, you're probably in the right spot. And that's always stuck with me, especially coming from someone like Tim Keller. And yeah, it's scary. It's hard, but I'm amazed when it comes to discipleship. I mean, Jesus was willing to disappoint everyone except his Father. I mean, if I really sit with that, that's as costly as it gets, including disappointing his mother at the wedding in Cana.
Right.
Including when he gets lost at the temple. Where did you think I would be? I had to be in my Father's house. So he's willing to disappoint even those closest to him that love him and he loves them the most, except his Father. And that's the pick up your cross and follow me, to say, I'm going to make some enemies here in this. And that's going to be very, very difficult over the long term. But that's why if we're not committed that Jesus is the great either or first, then we'll never be able to follow him in the both and later.
So is there an area of both and overlap that for you is a struggle that you know you're called to, but you really have a difficult time with?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the whole same-sex discussion is one that I wrestle over this because I believe in the traditional view of marriage, but at the same time, I'm also aghast and horrified by the way in which many evangelicals have treated those who are of same-sex attraction, and I struggle with that. And I've been shot at from both sides on this discussion as well. Mm-hmm. And that's hard, but I do want people to say, even if they disagree with me, they say, JR, I disagree with you. You live by your convictions, but I know that you respect me and you love me, even in the midst of our disagreements. I think that's one of the best gifts we can give people in this, even in the midst of our disagreements.
I'm glad you bring that issue up, because I think it's the one where I've had a lot of conversations with friends who theologically are on either side of of that issue, but nonetheless are trying to hold that intention like you are in this sacred overlap kind of way.
Yeah.
The problem is, what do you do when you're convinced that's the right way to hold this issue and you're trying to be respectful and loving and gracious, but the reality, and sometimes frankly the legal reality of the culture in which you exist, forces you into an either-or posture. So, for example, there have been Christian nonprofits, parachurch organizations, colleges and universities, even denominations that have tried to hold that tension, but it looks more and more like the legal realities are going to force them to pick a side into this either-or kind of thing, and then you end up, so what do you do there? Like, I have the benefit of, I'm not leading a big global ministry that has to make a call on its marriage policy.
Yeah.
But there are faithful women and men who are leading in those roles. What do you coach them to do?
Yeah. With this whole concept and this whole book, there's a prayer that I'm encouraging all leaders that I work with. And this is a prayer with fear and trembling that I pray regularly is, Lord, would you give me wisdom, courage, and compassion? All three are important. Three-legged stool on this. If I have wisdom and courage without compassion, I'm very careless, and I mean care-less. I don't have care, and that's certainly not a mark of following Jesus. If I have compassion and wisdom but no courage, I can be pretty riskless. But if I have courage and courage and compassion but no wisdom, I can be really reckless. And so it's really important that I have all three, because wisdom, courage, and compassion is priceless. Is that a perfect answer? Like, here's the script of what you should follow? No. But I believe that if every leader went into every decision and every situation by just saying, Lord, when I think of James 1:5, right? If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives it generously and without finding fault, and he will do it. And I think we can really challenge the Lord to live up to his promise to say, I'm lacking wisdom, I need it. But I need courage, because once I discern what I need to do, it's going to cost me one way or the other. And if I'm not doing it in love, 1 Corinthians 13, what am I doing? And so all three of those are important. I do think, though, there are times we have to make either or decisions in situations. But I also think that when we disagree, we can't disengage. And I think that's been the biggest fault, is that oftentimes we're not willing to stay in. We just retreat back to our bunkers. And I think it was Rick Warren who said, our culture has accepted these two huge lies that say, first of all, if you disagree with someone, that you must fear them or you must hate them. And the second is, to love someone, you have to agree with everything that they believe or do. And we don't have to compromise our convictions in order to be compassionate to people in our world. And so I just think that oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes those two lies exist in how things are couched and framed. And therefore we just disengage because it's less messy to just go back to our ways.
Absolutely. Well, JR, you're going to stick around because we're going to record this bonus segment to talk about the COVID realities of the church and what you've learned and what you're coaching others to do that. But thank you for this conversation about the sacred overlap. For those of you who haven't gotten the book yet, when does this book come out? It
comes out September 8th. Just after Labor Day.
I'm pretty sure this episode will go out after that. So it should be available by the time you guys are listening to this. It's called The Sacred Overlap, Learning to Live Faithfully in the Space Between. We talk about a lot of books on this show, and I always say, this is a great book. You should really pick it up. But I can honestly tell you, like, I strongly believe not only in you, JR, but in this book to the point where I contributed to it. So I don't do that.
Thank you for writing the foreword. I'm so grateful.
Well, and I don't do that very often. And I only do that for books that I really believe. I mean, to the point where I want my name on it, right? Not just a blurb on the back somewhere. So this is a book for our times, and we need this in all areas of our life. So thank you for the wisdom and courage and compassion with which you wrote it, because I think that comes through beautifully in it. Go pick it up. It's called The Sacred Overlap, Learning to Live Faithfully in the Space Between. And for our Patreon subscribers, stick around, because you're going to want to hear more from JR, I promise. JR, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Sky. Always good to be with you.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Phil Vischer Enterprises, that's Phil's company, and Sky Pilot Media, that's Sky's company. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/holypost. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, and more.